I planned everything down to the smallest detail. The restaurant was elegant, with candlelight flickering off crystal glassware and soft music filling the air. Our favorite wine was chilling on ice, and the diamond necklace I'd saved for was hidden, ready to surprise her. This evening, I hoped, would bring us closer again, dissolve whatever invisible wall had been building between us. I wanted her to feel loved, to feel seen. Rebecca looked stunning, as always. Her long, dark hair framed her face, and her eyes had that sparkle that first caught my attention years ago. Yet tonight, I could sense an unfamiliar distance in them, as if she was holding back, or perhaps holding something in. I brushed it off initially, telling myself it was just nerves on my part, but as dinner went on, it became harder to ignore. Her gaze drifted, landing everywhere but on me, and her laughter felt thinner, like it didn't quite reach her eyes. Finally, when we'd finished the main course and I poured us another round of wine, she took a deep breath. "Rob," she began, her voice softer than usual, "there's something I need to talk to you about." Her words made my pulse quicken, but I forced a smile, trying to mask the growing tension. "Sure. What's on your mind?" She glanced away, then back at me, her fingers twisting the stem of her wine glass. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about us. About me. And I feel like I need to explore a side of myself that I've been ignoring." A chill washed over me, but I kept my voice steady. "What do you mean, explore?" She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. I think I need to see other people." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the air from my lungs. See other people? Was she suggesting an open marriage? I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I gripped my wine glass tighter, trying to ground myself as 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind. You want to date other men?" Rebecca nodded, meeting my eyes with a raw honesty that cut me deeply. "Yes. I need to understand who I am outside of this relationship. For us and for me." The restaurant around us faded into a blur, and her words echoed in my mind. How could she say she loved me and, in the same breath, ask for permission to break the foundation of our marriage? The trust, the loyalty we'd promised each other. My world was crashing down, and all I could do was sit there, stunned. "Why now, Rebecca?" My voice was barely above a whisper, holding back the storm of emotion building inside me. Her gaze softened, a slight tremble to her lips as she replied, "I've felt like this for a while. I just couldn't bring myself to tell you. But I can't ignore it anymore. I don't want to hurt you, Rob. I just need this space. Space." The words sounded hollow, and it filled me with a sickening dread. This wasn't the woman I had married, the woman I had built a life with. I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. I barely remember the rest of that night. The diamond necklace stayed in my pocket, forgotten, as I left her in that dimly lit restaurant, surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to be a celebration of us. I got in my car and drove, no destination in mind, just a need to escape the weight of what had just happened. Hours later, I found myself parked by a darkened stretch of road, alone and broken. What I had thought was a temporary distance, a phase we could work through, was a fracture that ran deeper than I could have imagined. And as I sat there, the realization settled in. My life was about to change in ways I wasn't prepared for. The next morning, I woke up in the driver's seat of my car, stiff and disoriented. My thoughts from the night before came flooding back, each one a fresh wave of disbelief and anger. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I found a small diner, ordered a coffee I didn't really want, and tried to piece together what had happened. I still couldn't fully accept it. Part of me wondered if I had misheard, if I'd woken up in a bad dream that hadn't ended. Eventually, I pulled out my phone, finding it full of missed calls and texts from Rebecca. "Rob, where did you go? Are you okay? Please, just talk to me." Her words made my stomach twist. Last night, she'd asked for space, but here she was, reaching out as if she didn't just detonate a bomb over dinner. By the time I got home, she was waiting on the front steps, pacing. When she saw me pull in, she rushed toward the car, her face full of worry. "Rob, where were you?" "I was terrified something had happened to you." I stepped out and brushed past her. "We need to talk, Rebecca." Inside, I could feel her eyes on me as we walked into the house, a silence hanging heavy between us. I grabbed a notepad from the kitchen drawer, sat down at the table, and motioned for her to sit across from me. This time, I needed answers. "So, Rebecca," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I want you to explain again why you think this exploration is a good idea." She took a deep breath, her fingers twisting the ring on her hand. "Rob, it's not about you. I love you, but I feel like something's missing inside of me, something I can't seem to find here, in our marriage. I need to explore this part of myself so I can figure it out." The word explore hung between us, feeling like a sharp-edged blade. "So, you're saying you don't know what you need, but you think seeing other people is the answer?" My voice shook as I spoke, but I didn't look away. She hesitated. "I'm not saying I'll definitely do anything, but if the right connection happens, I don't want to ignore it." Her voice was barely a whisper by the end of the sentence. I clenched my jaw, trying to suppress the rage building up inside me. "You're telling me you might sleep with another man if you feel a connection, and you expect me to be fine with it?" My voice cracked. This woman, my wife, the one person I trusted completely, was sitting across from me asking for permission to be unfaithful. "Rob, it's not like that," she pleaded, reaching out a hand. "I'm not leaving you. I just need to figure myself out. I want to come back to you stronger, better." Her words landed like stones, heavy and unyielding. This wasn't something I could just overlook. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my voice even. "Rebecca, we've built a life together. We've made sacrifices, bought a home, planned for our future. And now you're saying that's not enough? That I'm not enough?" She looked down, her expression softening. "It's not about you, Rob. It's something within me, something I can't ignore anymore." I couldn't sit there any longer. The room felt too small, too suffocating. I stood up, pacing the floor as I tried to make sense of her words. "So let me get this straight. You want to go out, find a connection, maybe even sleep with someone else, and then come back here, to me, like nothing's changed?" I forced myself to keep looking at her, daring her to contradict herself. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. "I'm not asking for a divorce, Rob. I just need this time, this chance to feel alive." I laughed, bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. "Alive? And I'm just supposed to wait here while you feel alive with someone else?" She reached across the table again, but I pulled away, too angry, too hurt to let her touch me. I stared at her, feeling the weight of everything we had built together, everything I was now watching fall apart. "If you loved me, Rebecca, you wouldn't be asking for this," I said, my voice breaking. She didn't have a response to that. Instead, she looked down, twisting her ring, silent. The rest of the conversation was a blur of accusations and pleas, of moments where I tried to reason with her and others where I felt myself shatter entirely. By the end of it, we were both exhausted, but nothing had changed. She still wanted what she wanted, and I was left wondering how we had reached this breaking point. That night, I slept in the guest room, unable to bring myself to lie beside her. Our marriage was no longer the solid ground I'd thought it was. Now, it was like quicksand, pulling me down with every word she said, every tear she shed. And for the first time since we'd said our vows, I didn't know if we could survive this. The days after our conversation were a painful, hazy blur. Each morning, I would wake up alone in the guest room, the reality of Rebecca's words crashing down on me all over again. I'd stare at the ceiling, wishing it was just a nightmare, but no amount of wishing could undo what she'd set in motion. I'd seen cracks in other people's marriages before. Friends, colleagues. They'd confide in me, usually over a drink, about how they felt disconnected or unappreciated. But I had always believed that Rebecca and I were different. We weren't the couple that hid secrets, avoided hard conversations, or drifted apart over time. We'd promised each other we'd never become strangers. But as each day passed, I realized that I barely recognized the woman sitting across from me at our kitchen table. Conversations were stiff, almost rehearsed. She avoided my gaze, as if meeting my eyes would confirm the betrayal hanging between us. We fell into a kind of uneasy rhythm. I'd leave early for work. She'd stay at home or go out with her friend Matilda, one of the few people who seemed to support her decision. By the time I got home, she'd be distant, retreating into her own world while I drifted through mine. One evening, as I stared into the mirror, the exhaustion showed clearly on my face. Dark circles, jaw clenched, lips thin and unsmiling. I could barely look at myself. How had it come to this? Had I missed something? Had I been so focused on building a life for us that I hadn't realized the foundation was already crumbling beneath us? I poured myself a drink, letting the warmth of the whiskey settle my frayed nerves, and tried to think back to any sign, any moment that might explain why Rebecca felt the way she did. But all I could see was myself, trying tirelessly to be a good husband, a reliable partner, a provider. And now, because of some internal void she'd left unspoken, I was the one paying the price. A sudden thought hit me, one that made my stomach churn with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Maybe this hadn't come out of nowhere. Maybe she had been influenced by someone else. I thought about her friend Matilda, divorced and living a life that seemed fueled by fleeting thrills and a parade of boyfriends she cycled through like new hobbies. Rebecca had grown close to her over the past few years, and I'd noticed changes in her. She'd talk about freedom, exploration, and self-discovery in ways that sounded almost rehearsed. It was as if she was trying on phrases, seeing how they felt on her, slowly becoming a stranger before my very eyes. I tried to confront Rebecca about it the next day. I waited until we were sitting in the kitchen, the evening sunlight filtering through the window, casting an amber glow across the room that felt strangely out of place. "Rebecca," I began, keeping my tone even, "is this really about you? Or is it Matilda's influence?" She looked up, surprised, then defensive. "Rob, that's not fair. Matilda's my friend. She understands what I'm going through." "Does she?" I challenged. "Or does she just want you to follow in her footsteps? Because, to me, it sounds like she's been filling your head with ideas about finding yourself and exploring in ways that don't belong in our marriage." Rebecca's gaze hardened, and she crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "You think this is her fault? You think I don't have my own thoughts, my own feelings? I'm not some puppet, Rob." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "I think you're being swayed, Rebecca. I think you're letting someone else dictate the terms of our relationship." She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't need permission to decide what's best for me, Rob. I've spent years trying to live up to your expectations, fitting into your version of our marriage. Now, I need something different, and if you can't understand that, maybe you're right. We don't belong together anymore." The words cut deeply, sharper than I expected. I felt my throat tighten, the weight of it all pressing down on me, yet I couldn't bring myself to fight back. I watched her turn and walk out of the kitchen, leaving me alone, feeling like I'd just lost another piece of what we once shared. That night, I lay in bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling again, as if I could find answers written there. I thought about what it would mean to let her go, to give her the space she was demanding. But every time I considered it, I felt like I was abandoning everything I believed in, like I was letting her rewrite the rules on something we'd built together from scratch. In a last-ditch attempt to find clarity, I reached out to a friend the next day, a lawyer I knew who could talk me through options, explain what it would mean legally if she really did go through with this exploration. We met after work, and I laid everything out, trying to stay calm, collected. He listened, nodding thoughtfully before he finally spoke. "Rob, you have to decide what's non-negotiable for you. If this is a deal-breaker, you need to stand firm on it. But if there's even a part of you willing to wait this out, then I suggest you take a step back, let her make her choices. Sometimes, people just need to realize what they're willing to lose." That night, I drove home with a sense of hollow resolve. I had reached my limit, and if she crossed that line, if she chose this exploration over us, I wouldn't be the one left picking up the pieces. When I arrived, she was already asleep, a faint silhouette under the covers. I didn't bother going to the guest room. I lay down beside her, silent, a painful emptiness in my chest. But as I closed my eyes, I knew one thing. If she chose to walk away from everything we'd built, I would be ready. I would let her go. The weekend dragged on in a haze of silence. We moved around the house like strangers, each retreating to separate rooms, careful to avoid crossing paths. It was as if the air had thickened between us, filled with unspoken words and questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. On Sunday afternoon, as I stood on the back patio nursing a cup of coffee, Rebecca joined me, stepping out with an uneasiness I hadn't seen before. She sat down a few feet away, tucking her legs up on the chair and looking out at the yard, avoiding my gaze. "Rob," she began, her voice barely audible, I'm going to stay at Matilda's for a few weeks. I need space, to think about everything, to get some clarity." I'd prepared myself for this, but hearing the words out loud was like a punch to the gut. "So, this is how it's going to be, then? You leave, stay with Matilda, and, what, start exploring without me knowing?" She flinched but nodded, her face a mix of sadness and stubbornness. "It's not about hurting you, Rob. I need this for me." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "All right, Rebecca, if that's what you want, then you need to understand something too. If you walk out that door and pursue this exploration, things between us are going to change. You're not going to have it both ways. You're not going to see other people and then come back here like nothing happened." Her eyes widened, and I saw the faintest flicker of fear. "Rob, I don't want a divorce. I just want time. Can't we figure this out without tearing everything apart?" My voice was cold, a finality setting in that I hadn't felt before. "I'm not the one tearing things apart, Rebecca. You are. If this is what you need, then go. But know that when you come back, I may not be here waiting." A long silence settled over us, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Finally, she nodded, standing up and retreating inside. Within an hour, she had packed a bag and was out the door, leaving a gaping emptiness in the house, like the hollow ache of a missing limb. As the days wore on, I found myself searching for answers, some rational explanation that would help me make sense of what Rebecca was doing. I read articles, forums, even studies on why people in committed relationships feel the need to explore outside of them. But every time I came across a story that remotely mirrored ours, it ended in the same way. With someone breaking, someone moving on, and no real clarity about why it had to happen in the first place. By Thursday, a week after Rebecca had left, I realized that I couldn't keep waiting around for her to figure out what she wanted. I had to take control of what I could. I made an appointment with a divorce attorney recommended by a friend. It wasn't a step I'd planned to take so soon, but I knew that, for my own sanity, I needed to be ready for the worst. Rebecca was changing the rules, and I needed to be prepared to defend myself, even if the idea of legally severing our lives felt like a slow, tearing wound. When I arrived at the attorney's office, the weight of everything seemed to bear down on me all at once. Sitting in that sterile, dimly lit office with legal forms spread out in front of me was a surreal experience. I never imagined we'd end up here, drawing boundaries, setting terms. My attorney, a practical woman with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor, listened carefully as I explained the situation. She took notes, nodding thoughtfully, and when I was done, she looked me square in the eyes. "You have every right to protect yourself, Rob," she said firmly. "If your wife has expressed a desire to be with other people, even temporarily, you're in a position to establish terms. Emotional boundaries are just as important as legal ones." The words hit me, both painfully and with a sense of relief. She was right. For weeks, I'd been caught between fighting for my marriage and protecting my own dignity. And now, as hard as it was, I knew that I had to draw a line. This wasn't just about Rebecca anymore. It was about me, my self-respect, and my ability to move forward, with or without her. We discussed options for a separation agreement, something that would establish clear terms for both of us, even if divorce wasn't our immediate step. By the time I left her office, a rough plan was in place. If Rebecca decided to move on with this exploration, she'd have to do it without any support from me. No access to our joint accounts, no shared space, no half measures. If she wanted freedom, she'd have it fully, without the luxury of picking and choosing what part of her marriage she could keep. That night, I sat alone in our home, reading over the agreement draft, each line feeling like both a shield and a wound. I thought about what it would mean to hand her those papers, to put in writing what I'd been feeling all along, that she couldn't simply walk in and out of our marriage at will. When Rebecca came by the following weekend to collect more of her things, I was ready. She walked in, her expression uncertain as she glanced around the house, perhaps expecting me to be resentful or angry. Instead, I simply handed her the separation agreement, my face expressionless. "What's this?" she asked, her voice softening as she looked at the document. "It's a separation agreement," I replied evenly. "If you're serious about needing space and freedom, then these are my terms. You can have the exploration you want, but you can't have both me and that freedom." She looked at me, stunned, her mouth opening to protest, but the words didn't come. Instead, she looked down, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. I didn't say another word, waiting, letting the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me, a release of sorts, like I was finally reclaiming a part of myself I had been willing to compromise. Whatever happened from this point forward, I knew I would be okay. I would stand my ground, even if it meant standing alone. Rebecca didn't sign the separation agreement right away. She had taken it, reluctantly, along with her bags, and left without a word. For a few days after, I heard nothing from her. My phone was silent, no texts, no missed calls, no apologies. I told myself I didn't need her to reach out, that I was done waiting for answers, but the silence gnawed at me more than I cared to admit. I tried to keep myself busy. Mornings started early, with long runs that left me exhausted, if only to drown out the thoughts that crept in whenever I slowed down. My job as a forensic auditor provided an ideal distraction. Hours of focused work took my mind off things. But when the day ended, and the drive home loomed, that familiar hollow ache returned. Each night, I came home to an empty house, the silence feeling more like a weight than a relief. By the second week, Rebecca finally reached out. A simple message, "Can we talk?" My pulse quickened, a mix of dread and hope. Maybe she'd come to her senses. Maybe she'd realized this exploration was a mistake. I texted her back and agreed to meet that night at the house. When I arrived, she was already sitting in the kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked tired, her face drawn, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of the familiar love I once had for her. But I couldn't let myself soften, not when she had nearly destroyed everything between us. "So, Rebecca," I said, leaning against the counter, my voice steady. "What did you want to talk about?" She took a deep breath, avoiding my eyes. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about having to choose." She set her cup down and folded her hands, staring at them as if they held the answer. "I didn't expect you to give me an ultimatum." My jaw tightened. "It's not an ultimatum, Rebecca. It's a boundary. I have to protect myself, too." A flicker of frustration crossed her face, and she finally looked at me. "But Rob, you know it's not that simple. I'm not asking for a divorce. I just need time. I want us to work." I shook my head, feeling the frustration bubbling up. "You can't have it both ways. You can't be with me and search for something else on the side. That's not a marriage, Rebecca." Her expression faltered, and for a moment, I saw a glint of realization in her eyes. But then, she looked away, her voice softening. "I love you, Rob. I never stopped. But there's a part of me that feels empty, like something's missing." My voice came out cold. "And you think you'll find that with someone else?" She hesitated, and that was all the answer I needed. A painful clarity washed over me. She didn't understand what she was doing to us, and maybe she never would. I leaned forward, bracing myself against the table. "Rebecca, if you can't choose us, then this conversation is over. I won't keep fighting for someone who's halfway out the door." For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Then, she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not ready to be the person you need." There it was, the truth we'd both been avoiding. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a final blow. "Then I guess that's it," I said quietly. She didn't reply. Instead, she gathered her things in silence, moving through the house with a kind of quiet resignation that was almost harder to bear than anger or sadness. Before she left, she paused at the door, looking back at me one last time. "I'm sorry, Rob," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't want it to end like this. The door clicked shut behind her, and I was left standing alone in the house we'd built together. It felt surreal, as if I was watching someone else's life fall apart from a distance. But as the minutes passed, the finality of her departure sank in, and I realized there was no more hope to cling to. She had made her choice, and now I had to live with it. The next day, I called my attorney. There was no point in waiting any longer. I instructed her to proceed with the divorce, to begin the formalities and finalize the separation. Part of me felt a hollow ache at the thought, but another part, the part that had been clinging to my self-respect, felt strangely liberated. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt my life one step at a time. I threw myself into work, tackling new projects, taking on more responsibilities. I joined a local cycling group, finding solace in the physical exhaustion and camaraderie with people who knew nothing about my marriage, people who only knew me as Rob, a guy who liked to ride. Slowly, I pieced myself back together. Then one evening, a woman from the group invited me out for a casual drink. Her name was Ruth. She was warm, easy to talk to, with a quiet strength that drew me in. At first, I resisted, feeling a loyalty to a marriage that no longer existed, but Ruth didn't push. We talked about everything: our jobs, our dreams, the books we loved, the places we wanted to see. She was a reminder that there was a world outside of the pain I'd been carrying. As the months passed, Ruth became a steady presence in my life. She listened without judgment, offered kindness without expectation. I found myself laughing again, feeling the weight on my shoulders ease, even if just a little. I hadn't been looking for anything more than friendship, but with Ruth, I discovered what it felt like to be seen, to be valued. One night, after a cycling meetup, I found myself walking her to her car. The air was crisp, a slight chill that hinted at the approaching winter, and as we stood there, she looked at me, her gaze gentle and understanding. "Rob," she said softly, "I know this is hard for you, but you deserve to be happy." Her words stayed with me long after she drove away. I realized then that I was finally beginning to move forward, to leave behind the ruins of a marriage that had asked more than I was willing to give. Rebecca's shadow no longer loomed over every moment. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a resolve that grew stronger with each passing day. And as I looked out at the darkened street that night, I understood something I hadn't been ready to see before. The person I needed to be loyal to was myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Months had passed since Rebecca walked out, yet traces of her lingered in the house. An old sweater forgotten in the closet, her favorite mug tucked in the back of the cabinet. Each small reminder carried a strange mix of nostalgia and relief, as if I were slowly closing a chapter that had once defined me but now felt like a faded memory. With the divorce underway, I focused on my new routines: cycling, late nights at the office, and dinners with Ruth, who had become more than just a friend. She was a quiet force in my life, someone who didn't push or expect but simply understood. We hadn't labeled whatever it was we were building, and for once, that was enough for me. Then one Thursday evening, I received a text from Rebecca. Just a simple, "Are you home? I'd like to stop by." A familiar pang hit me as I read her message. Part of me had hoped she'd leave me in peace, that she'd understand there was nothing left to say. But I replied anyway, saying I'd be home, and braced myself for whatever confrontation lay ahead. When she arrived, I barely recognized her. There was a hesitance about her, an unease in her eyes as she stepped inside. I offered her a seat in the living room, and she accepted, curling up on the couch like she used to when we first moved in. The familiarity made me ache, but I forced myself to stay focused. "Rob," she began, her voice shaky, I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us, about what I left behind." I remained silent, letting her find her words, but her presence stirred up memories I'd thought I'd buried. Years of laughter, shared dreams, and quiet moments that had once felt unbreakable. "I made a mistake," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I needed something more, that I'd lost myself. But all I did was lose you." I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "And now you want to come back?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I hurt you, but I'm asking for a second chance, Rob. Her words hung between us, like a thin thread holding back the flood of emotions inside me. I looked away, forcing myself to process what she was saying. All the nights I'd spent trying to piece myself back together, the loneliness, the quiet strength I'd found in the spaces she'd left empty, they all rose to the surface, demanding to be heard. I've moved on, Rebecca, I said finally, my voice steady. I'm not the same person I was when you left. I've had to rebuild my life without you in it. She flinched, pain flashing across her face, and for a moment, I felt a hint of sympathy. But the memory of her last words before she left, about needing freedom and space, hardened my resolve. Rob, she murmured, her gaze dropping to her hands, I know I was wrong. I know I didn't appreciate what we had until it was gone. I thought I was searching for something out there, but I was just running from myself. Her words might have reached me months ago, but now they felt hollow, like an echo of something that had once mattered but no longer did. Rebecca, when you left, you made a choice, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. You wanted something else, and I had to learn to live without you. And now, I don't want to go back. She looked up, a flicker of desperation in her eyes. Is there really nothing left? Don't you remember the good times? I looked at her, and for a moment, all the memories, the laughter, the dreams we'd shared rushed back, filling the space between us. But they didn't carry the same warmth they once did. Instead, they felt like something fragile, broken beyond repair. I do remember, I admitted, my voice softening, but I can't forget what you did either. I can't pretend it never happened. A silence settled over us, and I saw the weight of my words hit her. She'd come here, hoping for forgiveness, hoping that the door she closed could be opened once again. But I knew that part of me had shut it for good, and even if I'd wanted to, I couldn't bring myself to step back into what we once had. Rob, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I know you are, I replied, and for the first time, I felt a genuine sense of peace in saying it. But I found something better. I found someone who sees me, who values me, and I won't give that up. Her face fell, and she looked away, wiping at her eyes. I could see her struggling to accept it, the reality she had tried to deny. So, that's it, I confirmed, feeling a bittersweet release in the finality. I wish you the best, Rebecca. I really do. But it's time for us to let go. She nodded, her expression one of defeat and acceptance. I'll respect that. Thank you, Rob, for everything. With that, she stood, giving one last look around the house, as if saying goodbye to a life she'd left behind. I walked her to the door, and as she stepped out, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. She looked back one last time, her gaze full of remorse, but I met her eyes with a quiet resilience, and for the first time, I felt free. When she was gone, I stood in the silence of the empty house, a new feeling settling over me. It was a strange combination of loss and liberation, like finally laying down a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. That night, I called Ruth, inviting her over for dinner. As we sat together, laughing over stories and sharing dreams for the future, I realized that I had found something that was mine alone, untainted by the past. I'd rebuilt, piece by piece, and the life I was stepping into was one I'd chosen for myself. Rebecca's chapter was over, and in its place, a new story was beginning. One built on trust, respect, and the kind of love that didn't need to question what it was searching for. The days that followed felt like a slow exhale, a release from the grip of doubt and lingering questions. The divorce was finalized without fanfare. Rebecca didn't contest any of the terms I'd set. No shared assets, no joint accounts, no half measures. She accepted it all, silently, and I took that as a final acknowledgement that we were truly over. But I had one last matter to resolve. Through mutual friends, I'd heard that Rebecca was now living alone, Matilda having moved on to yet another, fresh start with someone else. I wondered if Rebecca ever regretted her choices, but I knew it wasn't my place to find out. What mattered was that I had drawn a line, not out of revenge, but to make clear that I wouldn't be taken advantage of. The day I changed the locks, withdrew access to joint accounts, and set my boundaries was the day I reclaimed my dignity. By now, Ruth and I had created a new life together, one that was rooted in mutual respect and genuine affection. Every day with her was like a breath of fresh air. She didn't try to be the hero in my story or to fix me. She was simply there, bringing warmth and stability in a way I hadn't known I needed. She became my sanctuary, and in her presence, I found my true self again. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ruth turned to me, her gaze soft yet serious. "Rob, do you ever regret what happened?" With her. I thought about her question, the months of turmoil, the lingering pain. "I regret that it ended the way it did," I replied honestly. "But I don't regret where it brought me. If not for all of that, I might never have found you." She squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with understanding. In that moment, I realized how lucky I was to have found someone who accepted me completely, scars and all. Ruth was my second chance, my proof that sometimes life brings you something better when you let go of what's already broken. In the months that followed, our relationship deepened. Ruth and I took a few trips, exploring new places and dreaming of a future together. We even discussed buying a new house, somewhere that wouldn't hold the ghosts of the past. And with every step we took, I felt a quiet strength growing within me, a strength that came from knowing who I was and what I wanted. Then, one morning, I received a message from Rebecca. It was simple, almost formal. "Rob, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. I'm glad you found peace." I didn't respond. Her apology felt like an endnote to a song that had already faded. I wished her well, but I didn't feel the need to reach back. The closure I needed had come not from her words, but from my own journey forward. The life Ruth and I were building felt solid, real, untainted by broken promises or unspoken betrayals. With her, I found a partnership that didn't require a single ounce of compromise on my values. We respected each other fully, and for the first time, I felt the depth of love that came without conditions. Standing on our new porch one evening, with Ruth by my side and the promise of a future as vibrant as the sunset before us, I knew I had truly left the past behind. Rebecca's choices, her departure, they no longer held power over me. I'd reclaimed my life, my values, and my peace. And with that peace, I'd found my new beginning.